I still remember the exact moment I understood that silence could be louder than any argument I'd ever had in my life. It wasn't a slammed door. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't even tears, not right away. It was just my daughter, standing at the end of my hallway, her coat already on, her bag already over her shoulder, and she looked at me the way you look at a stranger on a train who has accidentally taken your seat. Inconvenienced. Slightly annoyed. Already mentally gone. She said, "Mom, I'm done with you." And then she left. I stood there in my own house, in my own hallway, with the smell of the dinner I had just finished cooking still drifting from the kitchen, and I couldn't move. I literally could not make my body move. My hand was still resting on the wall where I'd reached out to stop her, and the paint was cool under my palm, and I just stood there, listening to the sound of her car starting in the driveway, listening to it back out slowly, listening until I couldn't hear it anymore. And then the house went so quiet that I could hear the kitchen clock. Tick, tick, tick. If you've ever had someone you love walk out of your life, not dramatically, not in a fury, but calmly, deliberately, like closing a book they'd simply grown tired of reading, then you know exactly what that silence feels like. It doesn't feel like an ending. Feels like falling. The kind of falling where you don't know when you'll hit the ground, and part of you isn't sure you want to. I want to tell you my story. Not because it's extraordinary. Not because it ends in some miraculous Hollywood reunion where everyone cries at the kitchen table, and suddenly everything is forgiven and understood. I want to tell you because I think some of you have stood in that same hallway. Some of you have felt that same cool wall under your palm. And some of you, like me, spent years wondering what you did wrong, when the real question was something much more complicated and much more human than that. My name is Carol. I'm 62 years old. I live in a small house in central Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where the maple trees are older than most of the marriages on the street, where people still wave from their driveways, where the winters are gray and long and the springs, when they finally come, feel like a personal gift. I have a small garden in the backyard that I started after all of this happened, and some mornings I go out there before the dew has dried off the leaves, and I just stand there with my coffee and I really think, and I feel more like myself than I have in probably 2 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. Let me take you back to where this really started, which wasn't the day my daughter walked out. That day was just the day the wound finally became visible. The real story started long before that. It started in the ordinary accumulation of days, in the small moments I didn't pay enough attention to, in the ways I loved her, in the ways that love, somewhere along the line, got tangled up in something I didn't know how to name until it was almost too late. I had my daughter, Melissa, when I was 26 years old. My husband, Gary, and I had been married for 3 years by then. We were young and a little reckless with our optimism, the way young people are, the way you are when you've never yet been truly broken by life and you still believe in the back of your mind that things will mostly work out. We had a small apartment then, on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled like other people's cooking and old carpet, and when Melissa came home from the hospital wrapped in that yellow blanket, I remember setting her down in the center of our bed and Gary and I just staring at her. She had this tiny furrowed brow. Even then, even as a newborn, she looked like she was concentrating very hard on something. Like she had opinions and was simply waiting for the ability to express them, which, as it turned out, was entirely accurate. I loved being her mother in those early years in a way that is genuinely hard to put into words. I know that's what every mother says, but stay with me here because I mean something specific. I loved the physical reality of it. I loved the weight of her when she fell asleep on my chest. I loved the way she smelled after her bath, that soft powdery warmth. I loved how she would grab my finger in her sleep with a grip so tight, and certain that it felt like a promise. I was a stay-at-home mother for her first 5 years, which was not a sacrifice I experienced as a sacrifice at the time. It was simply my life and I was glad of it. Gary worked in sales, building materials, nothing glamorous but steady, and we managed. We weren't wealthy but we weren't scared. And there's a particular kind of contentment that lives in that space, in the not scared space, that I've come to appreciate more and more as I've gotten older. We had enough. Melissa had what she needed. We had family dinners and summer vacations to the lake and Christmas mornings that I can still see, perfectly preserved, in the back of my memory like photographs that never faded. Melissa at 4 years old, sitting under the Christmas tree in her nightgown, her hair tangled from sleep, holding up a stuffed rabbit with absolute wonder on her face. Melissa at 7, riding her bike for the first time without training wheels, coming down our driveway at this terrifying speed. and then looking back at me with a grin so enormous it seemed like her whole face was made of it. Melissa at 10, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, both of us doing our respective work, her homework, my grocery lists and bill sorting, in a companionable quiet that I didn't know enough then to treasure. Those are the moments I return to. Not the big ones. The small ones. The ordinary Tuesday ones. Those are the ones that, when things fell apart, I held onto like stones in my pocket just to prove to myself that it had been real. That we had been real. That somewhere under all the distance and hurt and confusion, there was a foundation, a genuine one, made of yellow blankets and bike rides and quiet kitchen evenings. When Melissa was 16, things in our house began slowly to change. Not catastrophically. Nothing happened that any outside observer would have pointed to and said, There is where it went wrong. It was subtler than that. It was the way weather changes, gradually the light shifting, the air getting something in it that wasn't there before, until one day you look out the window and realize the sky is a completely different color than you remembered. Gary got a promotion that year. A real one. We moved from the apartment we'd upgraded to, a modest 3-bedroom in a decent school district, to a house on the other side of town. A bigger house. A nicer neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood with a homeowners association and sprinkler systems, and a gym called something like Fit Life or Power Source in the strip mall nearby. Gary started working longer hours, traveling more. And I went back to work part-time at a dental office because Melissa was old enough, because we could use the extra money, because I had been home for 16 years and something in me needed a door to walk through that wasn't just my own front door. Melissa at 16 was brilliant and self-possessed, and I see now beginning to form the person she would become, which is the most natural thing in the world, and also for a mother who has spent 16 years being someone's entire world, the most quietly disorienting. She made friends I didn't fully know. She had opinions I didn't always understand. She was sharp-tongued sometimes in the way that teenagers are, testing the edges of her own voice, seeing how it lands. I wasn't alarmed by any of it. I told myself this is normal. This is healthy. This is what she's supposed to do. What I didn't do, and this is something I've thought about 1,000 times since, what I didn't do was look closely enough at who was shaping her while I wasn't looking. Her name was Diane. Diane was the mother of Melissa's best friend, Kaylee. They lived 4 streets over in a house that was, frankly, significantly nicer than ours. Diane's husband was a cardiologist. Diane herself had her own interior design business that she ran out of their home. She was the kind of woman who managed to be simultaneously effortless and intimidating, always well put together, always with something slightly clever to say, the kind of woman who makes you feel, without ever quite saying anything offensive, that your choices have been a little smaller than they might have been. I want to be fair to Diane here, because this story isn't about her being a villain. She wasn't a villain. She was just a woman with a particular worldview and a particular way of expressing it, and my daughter, my brilliant, impressionable, identity-forming 16-year-old daughter, absorbed that worldview like dry ground absorbs rain. The worldview, as far as I could piece it together over the years, went something like this: women who sacrificed their careers for their families had made a mistake they were too proud to admit. Dependency was weakness. Sentiment was indulgence. The measure of a person was in what they had built, what they had achieved, what they owned and earned and displayed. Love was fine, but admiration was better. And the people who deserved your full loyalty were the ones who had gotten somewhere. I am not being uncharitable. I heard these things said, more or less directly, in conversations at kitchen tables and carpool pickups over the course of years. I heard them said gently and humorously and as pieces of casual wisdom, the way people share their beliefs when they're confident those beliefs are simply correct. And I watched my daughter nod. I watched my daughter begin to measure things differently. It didn't affect our relationship immediately. It was slow. It was the kind of slow that's almost impossible to notice when you're inside it. There would be a comment at dinner, something about a news story about a woman who had given up a career, and Melissa would say something slightly sharp, something that carried a judgment inside it, and I'd feel a small pinch somewhere behind my sternum and I'd let it go. Because she was a teenager. Because they're supposed to challenge you. Because picking every battle means losing the war, or whatever wisdom I was operating on at the time. But the comments accumulated, and the distance under them quietly grew. She went to college in Philadelphia. A good school. She earned it, worked incredibly hard, and I was genuinely deeply proud. I drove her there myself, helped her set up her room in the dormitory, bought her the little storage containers from Target and helped organize her tiny closet, And when I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot, I held on a little too long, the way mothers do, the way we can't quite help, and she patted my back in that particular way that means, okay, that's enough, and I drove the 4 hours home alone listening to the radio and trying not to cry, which worked until about the second hour. She thrived in college. Of course she did. She was made for it, the ideas, the debate, the building of herself. She called less than I would have liked, but more than some of my friends' kids called them, so I told myself it was fine. She came home for holidays. We had good visits, mostly. There would be moments of the old closeness, sitting together watching some movie late at night, or her coming into the kitchen while I was cooking and just leaning against the counter and talking like she used to when she was 10, and in those moments I would feel such relief, such pure uncomplicated warmth that I'd think, it's fine. We're fine. This is just growing up. What I was less honest with myself about was the other moments. The moments when she'd arrive home and her eyes would move around the house with something in them I didn't want to name. The moments when she and Gary would have long discussions about the economy or politics or business and I would sit there following along but not quite inside the conversation, orbiting it somehow. The moments when she'd mention Diane, or repeat something Diane had said as though it were received wisdom, and I'd feel that pinch again, older and deeper now, and I'd change the subject. She graduated, got a job in Chicago with a consulting firm, made real money almost immediately. She was exceptional at her work, focused and driven and strategic. She moved into an apartment in a neighborhood I'd never been to, but that sounded expensive when she described it. She met a man named David who had gone to business school, and had the easy, confident manner of someone who had never really been unsure about his own worth. David was not unkind to me. He was perfectly polite. He shook my hand at Thanksgiving and asked appropriate questions about my life, and listened with what appeared to be genuine attention. But there was something in the way Melissa watched him that I found myself studying when she wasn't looking. A kind of performance of herself that she did in his presence, a slightly heightened, slightly harder version of herself. Like she was always making a case. I noticed. But I told myself I was projecting. I told myself I was one of those mothers who couldn't let go. I told myself 100 reasonable things that kept me from saying out loud the one unreasonable thing that was true. I was losing her. Not to adulthood, not to distance, not to the natural evolution of a grown woman's life. I was losing her to a version of herself that had decided I was a cautionary tale. It was a Sunday in October when I first understood it clearly. I'd driven up to Chicago to visit, a surprise which in retrospect was a mistake, though the surprise itself wasn't the issue. I had called ahead properly. I arrived at her apartment for brunch and she buzzed me up. And when I came in she was on a call, so she gestured to the kitchen and mouthed, "Sorry, give me a minute," which was fine. The apartment was beautiful. Everything considered and placed. I stood in the kitchen and looked around at all this evidence of her life without me, and I felt something I am not ashamed to name, pride. Genuine, uncomplicated pride. She had built this. She had worked for this. I was glad. But then the call ended and she came in and poured herself a coffee and looked at me. And there was something in that look, brief, barely there, like a shadow moving across a wall, that I felt rather than saw. Like I was a chore she had agreed to. We had a nice enough brunch. We talked about her work, about David, about a trip they were planning to Portugal. She asked about my job at the dental office, which I'd been at for 12 years by then, and I mentioned they'd given me more responsibility, managing schedules and billing, and she nodded and said, "That's good, Mom," in the same tone you'd use with a child who had drawn you a picture. I drove home that Sunday and I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. That was the first time I let myself think it clearly. She is ashamed of me. I want to be careful here. I want to be honest. Because it was never that simple. I don't think Melissa sat down one day and decided to be ashamed of her mother. I don't think shame is something she would have even named what she felt. It was more like, I had become, in the story she was telling about herself, a character she needed to distance herself from in order to feel fully like the person she was becoming. I was the evidence of a life she'd decided not to have. The stay-at-home years, the modest income, the contentment with small things. These were not virtues in her new understanding of the world. They were warnings. And every time she looked at me, she was looking at what she was afraid of becoming. This is the thing about love between mothers and daughters. It is so entangled, so deep and old and complicated, that sometimes the very closeness of it becomes the problem. She hadn't learned to be ashamed of a stranger. She'd learned to be ashamed of someone she came from. And there is a particular cruelty in that, not because she meant it cruelly, but because it gets into the exact places where a mother is most tender. It got worse after she and David got engaged. The engagement was beautiful. He proposed in Portugal, which I heard about through a text and then a longer phone call the next day. She sent pictures. I cried looking at them. I called Gary in from the other room and showed him, and he said, "She looks happy," and I said, "She does." And we stood there together looking at our daughter's face on my phone screen, lit up in some Portuguese evening light, happier than either of us had ever made her. And that was complicated. In the best possible way, but complicated. The wedding planning, though, that is where the fractures that had been growing in the dark finally started reaching the surface. She wanted a large wedding. Expensive. The kind that gets photographed professionally and ends up looking like a magazine spread. And I understood. I wanted her to have everything she wanted. But Gary and I had limits. Real ones. We'd been saving for years, had set aside what felt like a significant contribution, and it was genuinely, but it was also by the scale she was imagining, not enough. The first conversation about the budget was uncomfortable. The second one was painful. By the third, Melissa said to me quietly across a table at a restaurant she'd chosen in Chicago, "I feel like you've never really invested in me, Mom. Not in the ways that matter." I remember the restaurant had these Edison bulbs hanging low over the tables, and they gave everything this warm sepia light. I remember my water glass had a slice of cucumber in it. I remember these details with the hyperclarity that traumatic moments sometimes produce, where everything surrounding the wound becomes crystalline. I said, "Melissa, I gave you 36 years. She said, "I know, but I needed you to give me something I could use." I didn't say anything after that. I picked up my water glass and looked at that cucumber slice, and I thought about every school play I'd attended in a cardigan that was getting thin at the elbows because I'd spent the clothing budget on her winter coat. I thought about the summer I didn't take a vacation because she needed braces. I thought about the thousands and thousands of small economies I had practiced without resentment, without keeping score, because that was just what you did, that was just love, that was just the job. And I thought, she doesn't see any of it. Or worse, she sees it and it doesn't count. The months leading up to the wedding were the hardest stretch of my relationship with my daughter that I'd ever experienced. There were things said that I have not repeated to anyone, things that I turned over in the nights afterward like rough stones I was trying to smooth. She accused me, in one terrible phone call, of being passive-aggressive for offering to help with centerpieces when she'd already hired a florist. She told me in another conversation that she'd always felt invisible around me, which I still don't fully understand, since I spent most of her childhood making sure she was the most visible person in any room we entered. She said that Gary and I had modeled a kind of mediocrity that she'd had to actively unlearn. Mediocrity. I have thought about that word probably every single day for 3 years. The wedding happened. It was beautiful. I wore a navy dress and had my hair done, and I danced with Gary to a song we used to play when Melissa was little. And I watched my daughter marry this man who clearly loved her in his way. And I felt simultaneously the greatest joy and the most profound loneliness I had ever experienced inside the same body, inside the same hour. After the wedding, she pulled back further. The calls became less frequent. When we did speak, there was a new formality, a kind of managed politeness that was somehow worse than the arguments, because at least in the arguments we were still reaching for each other. The politeness felt like a final answer. And then came the day I told you about at the beginning. She had come home to my house, our house, the house in Ohio, for what was supposed to be a weekend visit. Just her. David was on a work trip. I had prepared everything I knew she liked. I had made her favorite dinner, the chicken piccata I'd been making since she was a teenager. I had changed the sheets in her old room. I had, and I am not above admitting this, rehearsed a version of a difficult conversation I'd been needing to have, a gentle one, about how I was feeling the distance between us and whether we could try to find our way back to each other. I don't know exactly what I said wrong. Even now, having gone over it 100 times, I can't isolate the single sentence that broke things open. I think it was simply the conversation itself, the attempt that felt like a violation to her, like I was asking for something she had decided not to give. She shut down quickly, that particular way she has, where her face becomes very still and her voice becomes very even, and I kept talking, filling the silence the way I always have, and at some point she stood up from the kitchen table and picked up her bag from where she'd set it by the door. And she said, "Mom, I'm done with you." She said it calmly. That's the part one can never quite get past. Not in anger, not in tears. Just with a kind of finality, like she had been carrying the decision for a long time and had simply quietly stopped carrying it. And then she was gone. I stood in my hallway for I don't know how long. Gary was out at a friend's house. I was alone. I think I finally moved when the kitchen timer went off. I'd left something in the oven, and my body responded to the sound automatically, while my mind was still standing in the parking lot of a Chicago restaurant looking at a cucumber slice in a water glass. I ate dinner alone at my kitchen table. I don't remember what it tasted like. That night I lay in bed and I stared at the ceiling and I did what I think most mothers in my position would do. I went through everything. Every moment, every word, every choice. I examined myself the way you examine a piece of fruit that's gone bad, looking for where it started, the bruise at the center, the moment I could have done differently. I apologized to the ceiling for things I hadn't done and things I had. I made bargains with the dark. I cried until my eyes felt like they'd been turned inside out, and then I lay there dry and hollowed and just quiet. I want to tell you that I fell apart after that. And I did for a while. Not dramatically, I kept going to work, I kept cooking, I kept existing in the world in the way that you do. But something in me was very, very still. Like a part of me had gone into some deep interior room and closed the door. Gary knew something was terribly wrong, though I struggled to explain it to him fully. He and Melissa had their own complicated dynamic. He loved her and was proud of her but had always been a little baffled by the harder edges of her. The way some fathers are baffled by daughters who are sharper than the world prepared them for. He said, "She'll come around," which was both probably true and also entirely beside the point. What I needed wasn't reassurance that the future would be better. What I needed was someone to sit with me in the present, in the pain of it. I didn't let myself hear from her for 2 months. Not 2 months of deliberate silence. She didn't reach out, and I, for once, didn't reach toward her. I sat with the space between us and I let myself feel the full weight of it. And something strange happened in that stillness. I started slowly to hear a voice that I recognized dimly as my own. Not the mother voice, not the accommodating voice, not the voice that had spent 36 years arranging itself around other people's needs. A quieter voice. An older voice. A voice that had been there all along, under everything, just waiting for enough silence to be audible. And what it said at first wasn't profound. It just said, "You're tired." That sounds simple. Sounds obvious. But if you've spent decades being the person who absorbs, who adjusts, who keeps going, who carries the emotional weight of a family on a posture so practiced it looks effortless, if you've done that long enough, the simple acknowledgement that you are tired can feel like being seen for the first time in years. I started walking. Not because anyone told me to. Not as a strategy. I just started walking in the mornings because I needed to do something with my body that wasn't work, and wasn't sitting in my own thoughts and wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I'd walk through the neighborhood in the early morning when the light was still gold and low, when the maple trees were just starting their October turn, when the air had that particular fall smell, that dry leaf and cool earth smell that I have loved since I was a girl. And I'd walk and I wouldn't think about Melissa and I wouldn't think about Gary and I wouldn't think about what I'd done wrong. I'd just look at things. The way the light came through a gap in the trees. The way someone had planted yellow mums along their front path. The way a dog at the end of a leash looked back at its owner with such uncomplicated love. I started to cry sometimes on those walks. Not the dry, despairing tears of that first night. These were different. These were softer. Like something that had been frozen for a long time was beginning to thaw. I called my friend Patricia, who I'd let drift over the years the way you let people drift when you're very busy being someone's mother and someone's wife. Patricia and I had been close in our 20s and I'd missed her in the vague, constantly deferred way that you miss things you don't have time for. I called her on a Saturday afternoon and she answered on the second ring and said, "Carol, it's been so long." And something about the way she said my name, just my name, no role attached to it, not mom, not mom's wife, just Carol, made me have to breathe for a second before I could speak. We talked for 2 hours. We started meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings at a place near her house. And I started slowly to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by my relationship to other people. I am someone who likes to read. I am someone who finds enormous satisfaction in growing things. I am someone who has opinions about things that have nothing to do with anyone else's life. I am funny sometimes in a dry way that Gary has always appreciated and that Melissa used to love when she was younger. I am someone who, when I was in my 20s, used to paint badly, joyfully, with no ambition whatsoever, and had forgotten entirely. I bought a set of paints. I painted badly and joyfully and with no ambition whatsoever, and it was one of the most quietly radical things I had done in years. I started the garden in the spring. It was a practical project with completely impractical emotional stakes. I'd never gardened seriously before, just some herbs in a window box, and I dug up a corner of the backyard on an afternoon in March when the ground was still half frozen, and Gary came to the window and looked out at me with an expression somewhere between concern and admiration, and I waved at him, and he shook his head and went back to whatever he was doing. I ordered seeds online. I read about soil. I made mistakes and learned from them with a patience that I was, with some surprise, discovering I possessed. There's something about tending a garden that does something specific to grief. The grief doesn't go away, but it gets put into proportion somehow by the simple insistence of living things on continuing to live. You plant a seed and it doesn't ask you any questions. It doesn't need you to have done everything right. It just needs water and light and a little attention, and in return it grows, and the growing is its own full answer to everything. My tomatoes that first summer were extraordinary. I want to tell you about the letter, because the letter is the part of this story that I didn't expect, and it's the part that changed the shape of everything. 11 months after Melissa walked out of my hallway, I received a letter. Actual paper, actual handwriting, in an envelope with a Chicago return address in my daughter's handwriting. I stood at my mailbox with it for a long moment before I brought it inside. I set it on the kitchen table and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat down and I looked at it for a while. Then I opened it. It was 3 pages. I won't tell you everything it said because some of it belongs only to the two of us. But I will tell you what mattered. She said she had been in therapy. She said the therapist had helped her see some things about herself that she hadn't been willing to see. She said she had mistaken her ambition for clarity, and her distance for strength, and that she understood now, partially, what it had cost her. She said she was sorry for the word mediocrity. She said it in exactly those terms. She said, "I'm sorry for the word mediocrity. I didn't mean what it sounded like, but I also, in some way, meant exactly what it sounded like. And that says something about me that I've had to spend a long time sitting with." She said she didn't know if we could come back from where we'd gotten to. She said she was writing instead of calling because she was afraid I'd be too generous too quickly, and she'd be let off too easy, and she didn't want to be let off easy this time. She wanted to sit in the difficulty of it. She said she missed the chicken piccata. I read that last part 3 times. And then I cried, but it was the thawing kind. The kind that has something hopeful in it underneath the sadness. I waited a week before I responded. Not out of cruelty, not to make her wait for its own sake, but because I needed the week. I needed to figure out what was true for me, separate from what was easy, separate from what was generous, separate from what was just the old impulse to smooth everything over and restore the surface. I needed to know what I actually felt, and what I actually wanted before I said anything. What I felt was hurt. Still genuinely hurt. And also love. Still genuinely love. And also, for the first time in 36 years of motherhood, something I can only describe as a clear-eyed dignity. A knowledge of what I had given and what it was worth, not in her accounting, not in anyone's accounting, but in my own. I knew what I had done. I knew what it had cost me and what it had made possible for her. And I did not need her to validate that in order for it to be true. I wrote her back. I told her I loved her. I told her I had been hurt in ways that I was still sorting through. I told her I was not willing to go back to the way things had been, where I accommodated and absorbed and asked for nothing, where I made myself small enough to avoid conflict. I told her I was, at 61 years old, only just beginning to understand how much room I was actually entitled to take up. I told her that if we were going to find our way back to each other, it would have to be to something new. Not the old version, not the childhood kitchen, not the relationship where I needed her approval or she needed my smallness. Something honest. Something equal. Something where we could both say the hard things and stay in the room. I told her about my garden. I told her about Patricia and the Saturday coffees. I told her about the painting. She called me the Sunday after she received the letter. We talked for a long time. There were silences in the conversation that were not comfortable but were somehow necessary. Spaces where we were both just breathing with the truth of things. She told me about the therapy, about some of what she'd understood. I told her about the walks, about the morning light through the maples. There was no grand reconciliation moment, no dramatic breakthrough. It was tentative and imperfect and a little careful. But it was real. It is still being real slowly. She comes home now 2 or 3 times a year, and the visits are different from what they used to be, quieter, somehow more careful in the good way, the way you're careful with something you've almost broken. We have disagreements still, moments of friction. But there's something in us now that can tolerate the friction without flying apart. I think it's because we both know, finally, that we've been further from each other than this. We've seen the worst of the distance. We know the shape of it. And neither of us wants to go back there. Last Thanksgiving she sat at my kitchen table while I cooked, and she asked me to teach her the chicken piccata recipe. She wrote it down in a little notebook she had in her bag. I told her the secret is not to rush the lemon, to let it sit in the butter for a moment before you plate it, and she wrote that down too, and when she looked up at me from the notebook there was something in her face that I hadn't seen in years. Something unguarded. Something young. Something like the girl under the Christmas tree holding the rabbit. I am not going to tell you that everything is fixed, that we worked it all out and now it's fine. I am 62 years old and I have lived long enough to be deeply suspicious of things being fine. What I will tell you is that we are in progress. That progress is not nothing. That in fact some days progress is everything. What I've learned, and I say this not as a conclusion because I don't think real life has conclusions, but as something I am still learning, still practicing, still getting wrong and returning to, what I've learned is this: love is not the same thing as sacrifice. I thought for a long time that they were the same, that to love someone deeply was to give yourself away to them completely, to have no edges, to cost nothing. And I think that is one of the most dangerous stories we tell mothers. Because what it produces over decades is a person who has forgotten they exist independently of the people they love. And when you forget you exist independently, when you become entirely relational, you lose the ability to be truly present with anyone because you're not there. You're just a mirror. You're just a need absorber. You're just a cautionary tale that your daughter can look at and decide not to become. I was so busy being needed that I forgot to be knowable. I think Melissa grew up knowing she was loved. I believe that. But I think she also grew up not knowing who I was really, because I was always performing a role rather than living a life. And I think when she looked at me and saw the smallness of my world, what she was really seeing was the smallness of myself. The self I had set down so many years ago in order to be useful. Picked it back up. It took a terrible year and a daughter's devastating words and a lot of early morning walks and tomatoes and bad painting and Patricia's coffee, and many long nights of honest self-reckoning. But I picked it back up. And I want to say to you, whoever you are, watching this, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, I want to say yourself is not a luxury. It is not something you set aside until the children are grown and the house is quiet and someone gives you permission. It is the thing that makes you worth knowing. It is the thing your children are watching. It is the thing they will either learn from or learn against. And the only way to make it something worth learning from is to actually live it. You are allowed to take up room. You are allowed to be tired and say so. You are allowed to have needs that are not anyone else's emergency. You are allowed to be, after all of it, after the sacrifice and the love and the loss and the hard work and the years, you are allowed to still be a person. I go out to my garden some mornings and I stand there with my coffee and I look at what I've grown, and the light comes through the fence in these long golden slats, and the tomatoes are ridiculous. There are always too many, and something in me is very, very quiet and very, very full. Not fixed. Not finished. Not arrived at some final peaceful conclusion. Just here. In my own life. In my own body. Taking up exactly as much room as I need. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything. If any part of this story touched something in you, if you've sat in your own hallway listening to your own silence, if you've driven home from someone's house and sat in your own driveway because you weren't ready to go inside, if you've ever felt like you were disappearing inside your own love, I hope you know you are not alone. None of us are alone in these rooms. We're just sometimes too quiet to hear each other. Leave me a comment. Tell me your story or just tell me you heard mine. And if this meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it tonight. We find each other in these places, in these quiet late-night sharings, and that matters more than I know how to say. Take care of yourself. I mean that.